Hey, here we go. Welcome, everybody. This is 3 Common Mistakes in Trauma-Informed Offerings. I'm super excited to see you logging in. I wish I could see your faces. I can't in this format. It's a little more fun that way, but at least you can be comfortable in your jammies or your car, whatever you're doing, and we can cover this important material. So my name is Lisa Danilchuk. I'll introduce myself a little bit more in a moment. And we are recording this. I know many of you are joining from different time zones around the world. If we have any tech issues, if you hop off, you're welcome to hop back on. If I hop off, I'll be right back. And we are recording, so you can always come back and revisit. All right, we are going to get through a lot of material today. And I'm going to try not to go down too many different rabbit holes and keep us focused, but there's a ton I could say about this. And I've got some stories for you too, so I'm super excited to share. So first things first, nice to meet you. I know there's some of you in here who I've known for a very long time. So nice to be with you again, but some of you are newer. So you pronounce my last name Danilchuk. It's Ukrainian. That's always the next question that I get. And I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the state of California. A few things that are probably helpful for you to know. I work in a very somatic and body-based way. So rather than a top-down cognitive mind to body is helpful, but body to mind is also very powerful. So that's my orientation. I'm also an experienced registered yoga teacher, certified yoga therapist through IAYT, and a Yoga Alliance continuing education provider. So some of you in here I know come from different lineages within yoga. Just so you know a little bit about mine, I came up through Yoga Works in the late 90s in LA. So that's an Iyengar, Ashtanga, Vini Yoga sort of blend. That was where my, actually with Hatha Yoga first, before that, my passion for yoga was born. But I've studied a lot in those methods, particularly in Iyengar with Patricia Walden and some other great teachers around the world. And I have a lot of respect for many different yoga traditions. So I know there's some of you in here who teach Hatha or Vinyasa or Iyengar or Yin, different strokes for different folks. I have a lot of respect for it. So I'm glad you're here, yogis. I'm also glad you're here, therapists. And I know some of you are both of those things, and some of you are other allied health professionals or just interested in trauma-informed practice in general. So I've also founded the Center for Yoga and Trauma Recovery here in Oakland, California. I've written 3 books all about yoga and trauma in some way or another. I'll be giving one away at the end. So stick around if you want a print book. And I'm also this year the president-elect of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. Great organization, tons of great training there. I'm a graduate of Harvard University and UCLA. My heart is always with UCLA, go Bruins. And I say all this and I give you all this context just to say, I've been thinking about mental health and well-being and body-based mental health and prevention and intervention and resilience and trauma-informed practices for a long, long time now. So these are some of the ideas I'll share with you today, are things that have been coming up a little bit more recently, some kind of interesting and chewy conversations I've had with folks. So I'm really hoping that this, whether I know there's some of you in here who've completed training with me, some of you who are new, I really hope this helps spark more of those conversations within yourself, within your communities, and just keeps kind of evolving us forward in a positive way. That's my intention for today. So I would love, love, love to hear from you. So there's a little Q&A box at the bottom, and you can type into that. You can also use the chat box. Oh, I have too many boxes. I might get a little bit crazy. But I'd love to hear, where are you joining us from? I know there's registrations in a ton of different languages. So I think I saw Germany and Portugal and Spain and Latin America. So I'd love to know where you're coming in from. New York, Wendy, hi. Angelique, Alberta, Canada in the house, Argentina in the house, Sweden, so beautiful, Central Valley, Cali, Vancouver, Scotland, upstate New York, also super beautiful, Chicago, yes, Wisconsin, LA, Miami, BC, Ottawa, Mont Tremblant, Quebec, Los Angeles, Awesome. Boise. Hey, shout out to Boise. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Those are coming in really fast. I love that we have such an international presence here. We've got East Coast, West Coast, Central America. We've got different provinces in Canada. We've got countries. We got, oh, hey, Michigan, Grand Haven. That's not the Upper Peninsula, is it? I think that's the lower part of Michigan. Yeah, we've got Argentina, Sweden, all kinds of different places around the world. Lower. Yeah, not as cold. Good for you. Awesome. Portland, Oregon from Iceland. Iceland's also, just thinking about it, I spent a week there once and I just love, love, love Iceland. Also gets cold, just like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right? So awesome. Welcome. I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are. I know that's not always the case, so just sending you some love if you're having a rough time. What made you want to join today is my next question. What inspired you to say, yes, I'm going to show up to this webinar. I want to learn. Okay, so we've got Kim says knowledge. Oh, I'm going to look at the Q&A box. Oh, we got Missouri in the house. Michigan, Portland. Okay, yeah, we can use the chat, so I don't have to go back and forth. Either one. Actually, I've got them both open now. Any other reasons? Reasons you wanted to join, what you're excited to learn, what you want to walk away with? I'd love to hear from you. And if you're just open and curious, that's totally fine. But if there's anything specific you want to drop into the chat, I'm totally open to hearing it. I invented a course on art and trauma before the pandemic, and now it's, yes, so vital. Curious about deepening my understanding of trauma-based yoga, healing my own PTSD through the practice, wanting to help others do the same, absolutely. Always looking for more tools to help inform my one-on-one movement for mental health business, yes. Keep finding my teaching taps more and more into trauma embodiment work, and that shows itself as my direction more and more. Yeah, it's really rich work, right? And there's a lot of layers to it. I think it's also really rewarding work. And I'm seeing it more like even in the business world and things like that, which is exciting. Creating a holistic recovery program. Thank you. Yoga is a big part of it. Amazing. I'm so glad you're doing that work, Gaia. And learning more about trauma-informed yoga teaching. Yes. Pamela, is that Pamela? I know. Focus on trauma-based yoga during my teacher training and want to learn more about the topic. I know a Pamela Brown. I don't know if that's you or not, but hi, either way. Julia, wanted to refresh with you. Nice to see you here. Working a lot with COVID long haulers. The trauma is deep. Yes, yes. Thank you for that comment, Tara. Okay. So we can keep the chat alive if you have questions come up. I might say, I'm sharing that on the next slide, or we'll save it for the end. I've got some time at the end for Q&A as well. So if you want to stick around for that, please do. All right, I'm going to close my little chat box now. Thank you guys for sharing. It's always helpful to learn about you. And I love just, we all know now being in this Zoom universe, it's like you're shouting into a tunnel, but I love to actually connect with you and hear your thoughts. So here's an invitation for you. Again, we're all pretty used to this online world now. Part of a yoga practice, and I'm talking about trauma-informed practices in general today, but I'm going to be talking a lot about yoga since that's my thing. I know it's a lot of your things as well. So we'll kind of weave in and out of just general trauma-informed in yoga with a pretty heavy focus on yoga, let's be honest. But many of you are yogis. Probably heard the word dharana if you're a yogi, which means single pointed focus. So I'm going to invite you to practice with me that even if your dog comes up to the side, which mine does sometimes when I'm online, even if your phone dings, you can reach over and switch it off. Let's take this moment to really be here. The recording will be here for you, absolutely, if something big does happen, if you do really need to shift your attention. But let's just set that intention together to really be here together. So suggestions I often offer are to turn the phone silent or off or airplane mode, to close out other tabs, to go full screen, and to set it up in a way that works well for you. I like to turn my volume up. And I like to remind myself just to be here now. All right, so that's my invitation to you. Another offering as we begin. This is a workshop that has the word trauma in the title. And whenever we start digging around the meaning of trauma, talking about what it is and what it means, it's really not uncommon for us to have our own associations and reactions, right? So this is like a super wide and general trigger warning when we're talking about or learning about trauma. And so I always like to start with resourcing. Now, I fully acknowledge, and this is something I've talked about in a lot of different settings, but I fully acknowledge that what resourcing for one person might not be resourcing for someone else. So I have this beautiful picture, I think, of what looks like a lake in Canada that I've never been to that I want to go to. But if you've been, if your trauma was that you got lost outdoors for, an extended period of time, and then that's not going to be resourcing for you. So I picked something that hopefully works for most of you in terms of a peaceful setting, but I encourage you to find something right now. I have a plant on my desk I like to look at. That's something simple. It might be a word, it might be an image, it might be a body movement, like an easy shoulder roll or a little head bobble. But just try to land on one thing right here, right now, that feels like a positive resource for you. Super common one, grounding, right? Feeling your feet or your hips. No one thing is going to work for everyone, but I encourage you to find something that feels right for you right now, that feels like a resource you can come back to as we continue to move through this presentation. Now, I don't have a lot of graphic examples. There are no really graphic images or videos in here, so it's not that kind of trigger warning, but I do want us to kind of be self-aware as we're here, notice our own bodies, and continue to ground into something that feels positive, resourceful, good. Fill in the blank with whatever words work for you, right? So we start with resourcing. I'm also going to start with an overarching view, so you kind of know what we're doing, where we're headed, what we're covering today. This is our agenda. Like the title says, I'm going to cover 3 common mistakes in trauma-informed offerings. And I'll talk about what you can do to prevent them. I'll also share some personal stories and examples to try to bring these things to life. Now, a lot of these are more personal examples that stories I've heard from friends or family or students. Some of the things I can't share because they're confidential. So a lot of these will be a little more from me, but they'll all have really clear suggestions for trauma-informed best practice. I'm also going to talk about the 8-week online training program I created at the end. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. Actually did a whole info session that you have access to, but we'll just touch on that at the end. And then I'll give away one of my books. That's my favorite part. So if we're going to talk about trauma, I always think it's helpful to start with what it is. And I'm not going to get into, we could spend the whole hour going into that, right? But I want to make sure we're oriented to a few common threads that are present with trauma. So usually if someone's experiencing trauma, it starts with some experience or multiple experiences, of threat, of harm, or of exclusion. Now, if you look in the textbooks, DSM and other places, they might talk about physical abuse, sexual abuse, but exclusion isn't something that's always included in there. But I include it in here because we're going to talk a lot more about it and how this trauma-informed overlaps with other practices. But we are a social species, and especially when we're really young, exclusion can initiate a threat response. So a lot of times people will say, oh, well, nobody was threatening to hit me, or, oh, I experienced neglect, but I didn't experience trauma. But we forget that in our bodies, when we're really young and we're physically dependent for life on other beings, being excluded can feel like a life or death experience in our own bodies and nervous systems, okay? So trauma usually begins with an experience of threat, harm, or exclusion. And with PTSD and complex trauma, there's an impact from that experience on our mind, on our body, on our relationships. So we might say a biopsychosocial impact. I could go into further, like it impacts us spiritually, it impacts us creatively, it impacts us vocationally, yes, all those things, but we can kind of narrow in the focus so we don't go down all the rabbit holes. we can narrow in the focus to say this experience had an impact on mind, body, and relationships, right? And it's usually the experience that we refer to when we're treating trauma, right? We're treating whatever's still alive in the body, the impact of the experience, not the experience itself. If anyone here has a time machine, great. I'd love to borrow it, but we can't really go back and change what happened, but we can work with what's happening in our mind, what's happening in our body, and how our relationships and everything is carrying that experience forward. Okay, so that's super foundational, super general places to root ourselves in terms of what trauma is and what we're talking about here. Now, I also want to speak to why being trauma-informed matters, okay? Because trauma-informed practices, I think, are getting more popular. I'm seeing more of it these days. And at the heart of helping professions is typically this commitment to do no harm. And I honestly think that if we're not trauma-informed, if we don't understand how the human body responds to threat to some degree, as much as we can, it's not like any of us know everything, but if we don't understand the basics we've gathered together as a scientific community, as a clinical community, if we don't understand that, I think we're really at risk of doing harm unintentionally. So when a practice is trauma-informed, we have insight that helps us minimize harm, like reduce it, and maximize opportunities for healing because we can understand, oh, maybe this is where that behavior is coming from, or, oh, that makes sense. That fits into a model of trauma that I understand. And so maybe that's where this behavior is coming from. So if teaching or leadership is not trauma-informed, I really think there's a significant risk there. I think there's a risk for probably unintentional harm, sometimes intentional for sure, but there's a risk for physical, mental, emotional, social harm. There's also a risk for intentional or unintentional exploitation, where students are serving the physical, mental, emotional needs of the leadership, and we'll talk much more about this. And there's also a risk for disempowerment, right? Where students can become dependent on a teacher or a method or a community or something to meet their needs, or to sometimes fall into an enactment of the trauma that they've experienced. So I think being trauma-informed, it can't hurt to know things, right? We could go down a rabbit hole with that too, but there's a lot we're going to talk about, right? It can hurt to know things. That's why we dissociate. We're going to talk about dissociation in a minute. But in terms of knowledge, I'm going to go back to Janet Jackson's album, right? Some of you know, back in like the 80s and 90s, having knowledge is helpful in general. It helps us to make choices that are informed, okay? So what specifically is trauma-informed yoga? That's a little bit of a newer practice. So one way we can define it as an approach to yoga that integrates awareness of post-traumatic stress, including the causes, symptoms, and pathways to recovery. And as I've already started addressing, trauma-informed yoga prioritizes the biopsychosocial, also spiritual and energetic, needs of the student or client over the goals of the class or instructor. So there's really a power shift that's even happening, I think, within this practice, and we'll talk more about that. All right, so let's start talking about the mistakes, the themes that I'm seeing coming up, and the things that I'm hoping will evolve as we go. So the first mistake is that a trauma-informed practice, be it yoga or otherwise, is not also attachment-informed, right? So you might be saying like, well, trauma-informed and attachment-informed are different things, but we're social beings. One of the primary social supports that we have, one of the primary supports we have in the face of trauma is social, to go to other people, be it a therapist or a family or a friend or a stranger who can support you. So it's hard to find an experience of trauma that doesn't have some sort of social implication. So when something's not attachment informed, this is when in the yoga world, maybe we're teaching information, we're teaching postures, we're teaching techniques without actually teaching to people. We're kind of leaving out that that social element, not so aware of it, not including it in our awareness. This is where I've seen this comment in teacher trainings where, you know, trainers will say, teach people, not bodies. So it's not just the foot, the hand, the leg, it's, you know, your foot, your hand, your leg, and there's a human experience on the mat in front of you or on the Zoom camera in front of you, as it may be. So our focus as providers matters. If we're teaching yoga and we're not aware of those relationships, it's more likely we could do inadvertent even harm. And our language even matters. Like I said, one of the things that I noticed as a yoga teacher for a long time is I was taught to say, and actually my dad came to one of my classes early on and was like, why do you say the spine, the leg, the arms? And I was like, it's just what we do in yoga. We say the hands, we say the feet. That's how we talk about it. And then I realized, and even though I still fall back on that habit sometimes because it was pretty hardwired, then I realized, oh, like, that's kind of disembodied, isn't it? So our language matters about how we're talking about our bodies, how we're talking about each other, and just, you know, keeping that truth of relationship, that truth of embodiment and connection alive in the room. On the flip side, sometimes as mental health professionals, we can use tools as a crutch. So this is where we say, sort of sometimes in a rigid way, like, I know my evidence-based practice, I'm going to go by the book, I'm going to provide a solution to my client, and they're going to go through this process. And I'm not saying like we shouldn't have evidence-based treatment, like we need to study things, absolutely. But it gets a little bit dicey when, as mental health professionals, and this can be protective, we remove ourselves in efforts to just solve a problem rather than being with someone in their experience. So the examples I just gave might not seem like the biggest risk factors. They're not maybe the biggest triggers, but these approaches, these experiences can lead to students, clients feeling disconnected. So in order to be more attachment informed, we want to include this awareness of relational dynamics. Now, I know many of you in here are trained mental health professionals. You're like, duh, okay, we want to do that. Want to be aware of what's happening in the room, what's happening back and forth. I think the yoga world and other allied healing professions are catching on to this a little bit more, especially with things that have happened in the world in recent years, catching on to power dynamics, relational dynamics, but also, you know, maybe in attachment words, approach and avoid, or who's leading, who's following, all of those things. If we're going to be attachment informed, we're also considering the impact of early childhood relationships on current behavior. This is a big one. Some of you know I've taught in juvenile halls and prisons and schools and recovery centers in a lot of different settings. And it's not uncommon in those settings for someone to, you know, what a system might say, like act out, right? This person's acting out. And it's not always the case that that system or that group is saying, I wonder why, or what's the cause of this behavior? Where is it coming from? And it's also not the case. Sometimes it is the case, which is great, and I hope increasingly so, but it's not always the case that we're thinking about what's the familial context this person came from, even if we're trained in attachment, what's their attachment style. And I don't think you have to be really focused on all the different attachment styles in order to be attachment informed. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. It's more about modeling and understanding secure attachment and providing a space that meets at least some of those needs. Okay, so we model secure dynamics best we can. We're all human. We grew up in families. We grew up in cultures that aren't perfect, right? But once we learn about secure dynamics and once we learn a little bit about attachment, we can intentionally model secure dynamics. And this includes awareness of just the basis of social needs of human beings. And I can't emphasize this enough. Like, yes, there's the rare hermit or a person who lives alone, or a monk on in a cave on the hillside. But really, we are wired and have developed to be interdependent and to thrive in some form of relationships. That's going to look different for everyone. But like I said earlier, we're also a species that from 0 to 26-ish, we're maybe decreasingly so, but we're dependent on other humans for our life, right, in order to survive, especially early on. So connection is important to us as human beings. Independence is important increasingly as we grow, but interdependence is also important, that we know, oh, hey, these are my people. They're there for me if something comes up. I know who to ask for a ride from the airport, to call if I go to the emergency room, things like that, okay? So this is leaning more towards being attachment informed, being aware of dynamics, considering the impact of early childhood, modeling secure dynamics, and including the awareness of the social needs of human beings. So here are some words and some things we can focus on to cultivate an attachment-informed approach. The first thing is it's relational. We're developing some type of rapport or connection. There's some opportunity, if it's a teacher-student, or it's therapist-client, or it's nurse practitioner-patient, to get to know someone's name, get to know where they're coming from, what's important to them. That might be different in different settings. Professional boundaries are totally fine to have, but there's some sense of connection between people. Another big attachment word is responsive, right? So I don't know if any of you have seen some of the still face experiments early on in attachment research, but they would have a mother just not respond to a child and then see what the child would do. And the child would do a lot of different things depending on their attachment style, but it would impact them, right? So when we're responsive, people feel like, oh, you see me. Oh, I'm here. Oh, I'm connected to this group. Oh, my needs are important. Oh, my needs are responded to, right? Being attachment informed also means building trust. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Brene Brown. She's written a million books. She's an incredible social scientist out of Houston, Texas. TED Talks, Oprah, all of it. So you've probably seen some of her work. Great podcast too. She talks about putting marbles in the jar as building trust. So trust is something that, doesn't happen overnight. That some of us in relationships just think, oh, just trust someone until you don't. But if we've had the experience of trust being broken, it can be hard to repair. So I like to think of this in a really subtle and consistent way of, we just put a marble in the jar. How do we do that? We do what we say we're going to do, or we stand up for someone even though they're not there. There's a million different ways we can do that, but it's a slow and steady process. It's not something that's going to happen the first time you meet someone. With that, we also build security, consistency, predictability. This is where people say, I know I can depend on you. This could be as simple as a therapist having the same appointment time week to week. It's not always possible. Or as a yoga teacher, same slot. I can think of teachers I have now who are teaching at the same time they taught it like 20 years ago. And I can't even, not like that's the gold standard, but I can't even tell you how much it like soothes my soul to know I can 9:30 a.m. show up even online now and see this person. So it doesn't mean we have to be super rigid or, married to things that aren't working for us anymore, but this sense of rhythm, this sense of predictability, that really connects with the trust. I know I can depend on you. Okay, so these are some things we can come back to build an attachment-informed approach. So a little story. People often ask me of like some of the biggest, I think a lot of times when people are studying trauma-informed work, early on, they're afraid of like, well, what if someone gets triggered? And certainly that happens, and it can happen in a lot of ways where it's really obvious in the person's body, or it's not really obvious. But one of the most outward triggers I saw in a yoga studio in a class was a very hyper aroused student. So this was speaking of consistent time and days, this was a Sunday 11 a.m. vinyasa class that I taught for a long time. And the student was this was like a room that fit about maybe 45, 50 people. And there was, I want to say she was like second row, third row in the middle. And she was moving very quickly. She appeared to be kind of physically uncomfortable. She was moving in and out of postures that we were all taking together. She was taking a lot of modifications, which is totally fine. It was distracting students. I could see people in the back row looking up. I could see people next to her kind of struggling with it. I want to make sure to point out, I'm not saying this person was doing anything wrong, but it did pose a challenge to the group and to me as the teacher, like, okay, how am I going to respond to this? How am I going to handle this? So what I did was I tried to be trauma informed because I understood this person looks hyper aroused. It looks like they're having a hard time managing it. It looks like they're trying to manage it, but it looks like they're having a really hard time. So I have that context of, okay, this person's probably hyper aroused. There's probably a reason for that. I don't know that reason. I probably will never know, but I'm going to try to respond in a way that's trauma informed and attachment informed in this case. So attachment informed was just seeing the person, right? And I know that being seen can be its own kind of trigger, right? So it's another conversation. A lot of how we respond to people is based on cues we're getting that are half conscious, that are subconscious, that are intuitive too. So I'm not saying that what I did with this person is the gold standard, is the end all be all. It's just what I did to respond, and it ended up working out, and I'll tell you why. So I made sure not to ignore it, right? Because it was happening. And I just approached them and they were on their back when everyone else was standing up. And I just said like, hey, how are you doing? Do you need anything? And, oh, I'm okay. I'm just having a hard day. Okay. And then, my back hurts a little bit. Okay, well, you might try this. If you're on your back, you might try hugging your knees into your chest, see if that helps. So this is relational. This is seeing the person. This is offering some opportunities to soothe what they're working with, being responsive, asking about their needs, right? And then in terms of building trust, like I mentioned, it's marbles in the jar. This was the first time I'd ever met this person. There were a lot of people in the class I'd known for a long time students. So I'm also sort of continuing to build trust with them, that I'll take care of them and sort of address what's going on in the room so they can focus on themselves. But the biggest thing I want to point out here is that in building trust with this person, I did not shame them or tell them, hey, we're doing tree pose now, can you stand up? That might sound like a silly thing to say to many of you. I have heard stories where teachers have sort of bragged about being, directive or being, offering a cue like that or feedback like that. So intentionally not saying anything that might feel shaming, because this is someone I'm assuming is in somewhat of a vulnerable state if they're triggered. Now, I'm not going to assume they're fragile, but I am going to assume my actions matter and how I treat them really matters. So with that, one of the things I did that I didn't know if it was going to help or it was going to work or it was going to make them feel better or worse, but it was sort of an intuitive choice in the moment, was I just stood nearby and I really grounded myself and I took easy breaths and I continued teaching from there. And I found that when I did that, not like on this person's mat, but a couple of mats away, I found that when I did that, it seemed to have a soothing impact. So I just placed myself nearby as a resource. Now, this is very different from what some of you may have learned in trauma-informed yoga, which is to always stay in the front of the room, to never move around. So this was a general population class. Of course, I'm sure many people in the room had experienced trauma. There was this outward, hyper arousal happening, and this is how I responded to it, and it worked well. Again, not saying that's what we always do, but it worked well in this circumstance. So I want to share what happened at the end because it's really interesting. This person did their practice. I did all these things I'm outlining, attempting to be trauma-informed, attachment-informed, hoping for the best. They left at the end, and then I was kind of hanging out and, cleaning up props and talking to students, and they came back after the other students had left and said, I want to thank you so much. And I was like, oh, okay, why? and she said, I am so traumatized, ironically, from my PhD program. And I don't know all the backstory of this. I don't know where she's going to school. I don't know what the dynamics are. This is just what she reported to me. I'm so traumatized from my PhD program. I can't seem to manage my body. I really, really needed this yoga class. And I really appreciate that you let me kind of do what I needed to do. Okay, so that was the verbal feedback that I got that I don't think we always get, that the choices I had made had helped. And I want to point out with this story too, that type of feedback is essential, right? We don't always get it in a studio setting or in a mental health clinic even, but having these opportunities to say like, how is this going for you? To have a little feedback box in the corner, to have a submission on the website where you can ask for ideas or feedback or questions, or just that open door, that can really help things feel responsive and attachment informed too. Go on about this forever, but we're going to move to our next one. I'm just going to check. I think there's a question. Oh, I'm in the wrong one. Oh, what steps can we take if a client or student becomes overly dependent, codependent, or overly attached? Okay, I'll get to that one. I'll get to that one at the end. We'll take that during question times. Great question. Okay, so second mistake I'm seeing a lot is programs or providers not understanding dissociation. So I'm calling this not dissociation informed. Dissociation, some of you probably heard this term. In a general sense, it means disconnecting, separating one thing from something else, splitting. In a mental state, we're talking about a separation of typically related mental processes. But in a strict sense, dissociation is not a bad thing. We're saying we're putting this over here, we're putting that over there. I'm dissociating the movement of my torso from the movement of my arm, right? Like I'm just lifting my arm overhead without popping my ribs forward, for example. That would be dissociating movement. When we talk about it in a psychological sense, it's still a word that's used to describe disconnection or lack of connection between things that are usually associated with each other. And it's also important to note that dissociated experiences are not integrated into our kind of usual sense of self. So this can lead to discontinuities in our conscious awareness and kind of that separateness at a cognitive or even personality level, identity, right? So this definition comes from the ISSTD website. There were a ton of people who collaborated to put this together. It's simple, but challenging to describe some of these processes, especially when there's such a wide range of what we see clinically and what we see in the face of PTSD and trauma. But I want to make sure to highlight all of the folks that contributed to that. In my words, dissociation is typically numbing to prevent extreme pain. And when we look at brain scans, when we look at what's happening, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm super geeky about it. I love learning about it. There's, opioids and all this stuff excreted that's helping us cope to stay alive. So in my words, dissociation is numbing to prevent extreme pain, to give us time to get to safety before processing, and ultimately just to stay alive. So you'll hear people say things like, I left my body, I crawled into a hole in the wall, I floated away like a balloon, I went and visited this really peaceful valley full of flowers instead of being in the moment. Remember earlier, I was talking about resourcing, right? And I talked about that beautiful, what I feel like is such a beautiful lake and beautiful place to be. So you can see how already dissociation is a coping skill. It's a way to get through something difficult. It can just get to a point when it becomes clinical, it gets to a point where maybe it's disrupting people's lives in other ways. So what does it mean to be dissociation informed? I think the first thing is understanding a hard freeze response. Okay, so a soft freeze might just be, oh, what's happening? What's going on? A hard freeze response in our bodies and our nervous systems is what we might also hear described as feigned death, collapse, tonic immobility, a dorsal vagal shutdown. Okay, so you might have heard some of those terms. If you haven't, most important thing is just understanding what happens when we go past fight, flight, fright, and our body just shuts down to protect us. So it's super important to understand that dissociation is protective. It's very somatic. It's in the body, in the autonomic nervous system, the brain and the nerves that go throughout the body. So to be dissociation informed, we want an approach that's really well paced. There's a lot of reasons for that. We want to be aware of and working with the dissociation instead of triggering it or reenacting it, or like poking at it, right? And that'll make a little more sense in a moment. So again, I just want to emphasize, we want to understand how these symptoms were a functional response driven to keep the person alive. And I think if we don't know about dissociation, we can really misinterpret these behaviors and responses, and we can attempt to remedy them or support someone in a way that's actually more harmful or detrimental. So here's an example of a super well-intentioned offering. Now, this is like a big conversation, right? But many exposure techniques, okay, there's a stimuli that's meant to evoke fear. And I was just reading an article last night on this too. I was like, okay, let me do a little more research. Let me see if there's something new on this. And the article was saying, hey, when people say that exposure techniques aren't working well with dissociation, but we did this study and the dissociated people did the best. We gave them the object that evoked fear and they scored the best at the end. So I want you to just consider with that, the difference between an exposure technique, say you're like afraid of spiders or snakes or something that most of us are somewhat afraid of, and you want to get over that fear because you're going on a hike through the Amazon and there's going to be spiders and snakes, okay? That kind of, maybe phobia or learning, getting comfortable with something you're uncomfortable with versus memories of trauma. So the goal with exposure is often to access the strong emotion, to process it in the moment with the support of a trained therapist or the support person that's there, okay? This is actually a photo from the top of Mount Diablo. A friend of mine works up there, and there's rattlesnakes and tarantulas. And so he shared this. And you could see, like, this person is not super happy. They're probably feeling a lot of arousal in their system. They're holding a tarantula in their hand. I would guess that's evoking some fear based on my associations, based on the look on her face. But it's not necessarily a memory of childhood trauma, right? It's kind of a different thing going on there. Still a fear response, still a threat, but a little bit of a different context, right? So if someone was like, hey, I know this tarantula is not actually going to bite me, it's not venomous, it's not going to kill me, but I want to get more comfortable with this, they might expose themselves as this woman is doing. Now, with things like severe childhood trauma, especially when we're talking about sexual abuse, and especially when we're talking about anything where someone's airway was blocked, a dissociative response would be that collapse, that feigned death, that shutdown, okay? So what tends to happen with people who have a history of dissociation, if it's common for them to dissociate, is like that's their go-to. Like I said before, maybe it's I go to the field with the purple flowers whenever something happens. So even if you're working with something as simple as the tarantula, someone who has a pattern of dissociation might be like, okay, yeah, put the tarantula in my hands. And they might just go to the field with the purple flowers, right? I'm just using that one as an example. They might go away. They might not really be present with it because the feelings that are coming up in response to it are too much. And the way that they cope with that is to split, to disconnect, to go away, to dissociate, okay? I'm not saying it's wrong or bad. It's a way to cope, but that's what they're gonna do, most likely, right? Someone else might get really, physically agitated and run away or run around. And I also just want to highlight the difference between, okay, let's hold this tarantula, which I can even feel a little activation thinking about it, versus like, let's hold the memory of sexual abuse when you were 2 or something like that. That's going to bring up a lot more memory, experience, and I think it's fair to say, although it varies from person to person to be sure, more sort of a charged emotional response. And so when we look at studies that say the dissociative people did best with the exposure technique, I say, of course they did, because they know how to manage intense emotion. They know how to, they have a go-to. Oh, I'm going to crawl into the hole in the wall. Oh, so while one person might be holding the tarantula and noticing what's happening in their body and settling it and taking a few deep breaths and then, you know, holding it a little closer to them and then doing the same thing again and getting more comfortable, it wouldn't be surprising if someone whose MO is to dissociate is going to say, yeah, I can totally hold this image of me at 2 years old being sexually abused and I don't feel anything, right? Oh, it's all, yeah. And there's a difference between having processed the emotion and containing or dissociating it, okay? So hopefully I'm making this point super clear. The goal is for us to somatically, through our bodies, through the whole of our nervous system, self-regulate and, you know, process something, not just to continue to split it off. Okay, so a little story along these lines. I had a client with a history of PTSD and dissociative symptoms that attended a trauma-informed yoga training while they were away back in their home state at a studio. And this person reports to me, again, I hear a ton of stories. I wasn't there, I don't know, but this is the story I heard. Reports that the presenter said, people are resilient, so it's okay to touch, right? Totally okay to touch in a trauma-informed way. I'm sure a lot of you are having a lot of feelings about that. And then within the training, people gave hands-on assist to each other. Okay, so the client then was triggered into a depressive state. Now, this is important too, because I don't think people in the training picked up on, oh, this is triggering for us. It's very different than the hyper-aroused student dancing around, or, you know, you go into a certain setting and people are fighting with each other. I remember in juvenile hall showing up and like, you'd have to separate two kids, or sometimes people wouldn't be able to do yoga because they were so physically, outwardly demonstrative with what was going on internally. Dissociation tends to be a lot more subtle. And this client was triggered into a depressive state. It took over 3 weeks after they returned to process and work through and recover to a place where this client could kind of function day to day, go to work, take care of responsibilities, things like that. And I actually think that's not, like, it might seem like a long time to some of you, it might seem like a short time. It seems actually like short to reasonable for me. It's like, yeah, that one thing, right? A hands-on assist in a training can leave someone with something that they really need to address and unpack and work through for a long period of time. So if this studio had, and this is Wild Yoga that creates these, there's a ton of different like yoga chips out there. If this studio had like a yes, please, no thanks, touch, no touch policy, you get to choose, we're all about consent here, I think this would have gone much better and prevented this person from all the work they had to do after that. So again, if we're dissociation informed, we're understanding the hard freeze. We understand that triggers aren't always obvious or outward. We understand that dissociation is protective. It's the person's nervous system trying to keep them safe, trying to cope. At a deep hardwired level, it's not a conscious choice. When we're dissociation informed, we're well paced with our approach. We're checking in verbally and non-verbally. Some people might say, oh, well, that student went to a teacher training or went to a trauma-informed training and they got triggered, but then they worked through it. So doesn't that mean it was healing? But I think it would have been much more healing if they had, again, an attachment-informed approach where the person was checking in and they could modulate how much is too much and do that over time. So we're pacing, oriented to working with dissociation instead of slamming through it with, you know, the tarantula in your face, so to speak, or reenacting it through the dynamics. Okay, so I realize I'm covering a lot. We've got one more and a little bit more information and then some questions. So mistake number 3 is disempowering dynamics. So dynamics that encourage all or nothing thinking, black or white thinking that's sometimes called. Dynamics that create dependency on the teacher or the model, and some business models do this as well. And dynamics that discourage open dialogue. There are other things we could point out in terms of disempowerment, but these are three big ones that come up a lot. So what are empowering dynamics? What do those look like? They encourage complex thinking, foster healthy interdependence and power dynamics, and encourage questions and open dialogue. Okay, so I've got a story for this one too. It's kind of funny. People always tell me their funny stories or their experiences with trauma-informed trainings and practices. So not that long ago, about a month ago, I met a career coach who said, I attended a trauma-informed training and got kicked out for asking too many questions. This is what she shares. I wasn't there, but I find it very interesting, right? So, oops, what would the empowering dynamic look like? Encouraging complex thinking. Oh, okay, you're asking questions. That's great. You're thinking about this from a lot of different angles. Fostering healthy interdependence and power dynamics. Oh, okay. Maybe we don't have time to talk about that right now and I'm the teacher, but we'll save some time for it later. Encouraging questions and open dialogue, right? So same thing as encouraging complex thinking. I'm glad you're thinking about this. Let's have a conversation. Or if we need to set boundaries, which we do as teachers many times, we can say, that's a great conversation. Let's talk about it after class. Or, oh, that's a great conversation for next week. Things like that too, okay? So these are really just a few examples, and there's a ton more I could say because that's kind of what I do all the time. But to come back to, we've covered a ton of material. As you're offering trauma-informed care, don't forget that last word. Like, just come back to care. How can you care for yourself, care for the other person, care for the system, and just use whatever you've learned from today in terms of being attachment informed, in terms of being dissociation informed, to respond to the situation with care. Now, this is a great time actually to address the question, what if somebody becomes overly dependent or overly attached? I was just in a lecture yesterday with one of my old professors from Harvard. She's teaching group dynamics. And she was talking about, for her, learning about boundaries, and particularly as an Asian American woman, she shared that it was difficult to know that setting a boundary was actually helpful for the other person, right? To know that sustaining her own energy so that she didn't burn out was kind of the better thing to do. So I think when you start talking about someone becoming overly attached or codependent, or I know a lot of yoga teachers who, someone will be talking to them after class and they'll stick around for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, or for therapists, people are calling or texting all the time, especially when it's not sustainable for that to continue. It's feeling out of balance. It's feeling like too much, maybe it's out of your scope of practice, or maybe it's, just too much, feeling too much dependence. It's actually super healthy for that other person to have a ton of different resources, to have a lot of different care around them. It's also super healthy for you to say, hey, that's all I've got for today. Maybe not in those words, but I have to leave in 10 minutes and then I'll see you next week at class. A question I often give people who are not therapists, who are wanting to ask if someone has a therapist or they're wanting to make sure they're getting care, is what other supports do you have? So if someone is really kind of latching on, or something feels codependent or it feels excessive, you might just pose that question to yourself, to the person outright, what other supports are present here? And then that's when it comes back to drawing a boundary and knowing that that's really the best thing for everyone involved, to step out of a disempowering or an unhealthy dynamic. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. So I love talking about this stuff, which is why I developed an in-depth training. We've got an 8-week Yoga for Trauma online training program starting next Monday, September 13th. So it's a program that's definitely attachment informed, dissociation informed, and empowering intentionally. So because I hear all these stories, you know, I don't know what's happening out there, but this is what I hear. And I think these things are super important. So the last cohort of 2020 starts September 13th, which is coming up. And I'll just share a little bit about the people in the program, since so much of what we do is about groups and connection. All this is on the website, so if you want to look through what we cover each week, we've got a great FAQ session as well. These are the topics. And we've got people from all over the world, just like you guys, yoga professionals, teachers, studio owners, TT directors, mental health providers, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, counselors, health and healing professionals. I like to highlight a few folks. Noreen, who is in Manila in the Philippines. She came to the program feeling like nobody cares about this. I'm the only one in Manila. And after she finished and did some extra mentorship, she's really positioned herself as a leader in the local trauma-informed yoga movement. And she's offering trainings. And she's also been working with survivors of sexual assault and exploitation. So if that's your field, I really encourage you to reach out to her. Her name's Noreen Bellarmino. We also got Shailene on the East Coast. She had a DBT psychotherapy clinic, wanted to build a yoga program to serve her clients, but like some of you maybe here, she was having trouble getting the yoga piece started. So now she's training and consulting with local studios to help make trauma-informed yoga more accessible, just to her clients and to the whole community. So this is Shailene. She is not afraid, and she is made for this. That's what it says behind her. And then this is Tara, who did the first online training program in 2019. She was working for a nonprofit at the time and offering individual yoga sessions. And this is, I think, what happens a lot of the time is people finish the program and they create their own programs. So it's not about creating a whole bunch of mini-me's or stamping things. It's more about empowering people to be who they are and teach how they want to teach. So she created Bloom Healing Yoga for survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual assault. And she is a badass. So for the fall session, covered all of this. We go for 8 weeks. So everyone has 12 weeks to complete the program. If you're interested in it and you want to apply, go to howwecanheal.com. You can use the drop-down menu or go to /Y4T directly. There's an application there. Complete the application, and if it seems like a good fit, we will send you an invitation to enroll. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, we've done this the last few times. There's an amazing training by Dr. Marianne Kate, who actually did a ton of great research on dissociation and the causes of dissociation. She could actually predict it based on her research measures, which is impressive. We have a great training with her, and just because it's so much easier for us if people enroll early, for anyone that completes their enrollment by Friday, you'll get an extra little bonus of this training, which we did publicly for $95. So it's what dissociation is, what causes it, how we can create healthy and healing environments for folks with DDs, how yoga can help and not hurt those experiencing dissociative symptoms. Okay, so we're coming in right at the end. We covered a ton of information, the 3 common mistakes, how to prevent them, being attachment informed, being dissociation informed, modeling empowering dynamics and tracking them. I also covered briefly the 8-week program in case you're interested in that. You can also get a ton more information on the website, including the info session where we go in depth. So now it's time. It's my Oprah moment to give something away. I would love to give a print copy of Yoga for Trauma to, I'm going to pick a number. Let's use the Q&A box for this. So go ahead and put your, I guess just your first name, or no, put your first and last name because there might be a lot of the same into the Q&A box. And I'm going to pick the 13th person whose name shows up in the Q&A box. All right, so I'll give you a minute to do that. Are your trainings recognized as continuing education with IAYT? They are with Yoga Alliance Canada and US, but I'm not sure because I'm certified with AIYT, but I don't know, I haven't gone through a specific process with them. So It might be if the person training is at IAYT, which I am, they might automatically, but I can't confirm that for sure right now. Anne, thank you for that question. Is the training online? Yes, it's all online. All the enrollment fees are on the website. Thank you so much, Lisa. We'll jump off. You're welcome. Okay, 13th person. So the investment's $1,250 or 3 payments of $324 for the person that asked that. Go back. Okay, now I'm going to count. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Uh-oh, but now I've got, oh, you got in the chat in the Q&A box. Okay, so I'm going to do what I said and put who responded in the Q&A box. Okay. Take me a minute. We need the do. Gina. 4, 5, 6. Hi, everybody. I see some familiar names. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Faye Fairman, congratulations. Oh my God, and then you just put your name in the chat at the same time. That's really funny. So you're the 13th person in the Q&A box. But because it's kind of confusing, I totally understand. Everyone who put their name in, if you, oh, that's really sweet, Angelique, congratulations. I always want everyone to be a winner. So my second book, How You Can Heal, is in a PDF format, and I will email that out to everyone who puts their email address into the Q&A. So even if you didn't win the print book, Faye, you can also in the Q&A or email me, lisa@howwecanheal.com, send your address so that Faye, we can send you your print book. If you're out of the States, it'll take a little longer, especially with COVID, but it'll get there. And yes, perfect. So you can put your email in the chat, but just so you know, everybody can see that. So, you know, I'm hoping it's a safe place here, but if you put your email into the Q&A box, I'll also send you a copy of How You Can Heal. Okay, now you get the real treat at the end for sticking around, not just a free book. Not just a free book. What is it? What's coming next? Pictures of cute animals. So I encourage you to care for each other and come back to that. I can stick around for a few questions. I also just want to close by thanking you all for your interest in healing in general. We need all of it. We need all of it. So keep going. I'll say thank you. I know you don't always get those when you're in a service role, but thank you so much. So I'll stick around for questions and I will keep them going on the recording. And I'll also just close with this cute picture of my dog, Iris, because she's amazing. All right. Thanks, everybody. What questions do you have? I'm going to go full face for this. Stop share. Hi. Okay. And then I've got to pull up the Q&A box and the chat. You're welcome. Oh, sweet. I love that. I'm going to not say it right. Migwech, thank you. Awesome. We'll follow up with you, Faye. You're welcome, Pamela, Gina. Okay. Scroll down. Let me scroll through this. Make sure we got all the questions in the Q&A box. You're welcome, Anat. Thanks for coming. I have a question about reaching the people who need this practice. Is being trauma-informed there in case someone who needs it walks in for one-to-one work? That's a great question, Agatha. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You're welcome, Mary. So I think it can be important to have services that are walk-in for sure, but that might not be sustainable for you as someone who's providing one-on-one work. So if you want to reach people who really need the practice, I would actually start with what's going to be sustainable for you, right? Like, can you... Let's say you can teach a class once a week and that's what's within your schedule, or for one-on-one work. Let's say you have the capacity of like working with 10 people or 20 people at a time, whatever the number is. I actually think what's more strategic in terms of long-term service is to find out what's going to work for you, make that availability clear and make the consistency clear, because the one thing with like clinic work with drop-ins is it's better to have a team that's going to be able to sort of rotate through to make sure someone's there. Or you think of like a crisis line, there's a lot of people that work there. So someone else had a question about marketing. Is there a way to reach out to a community to offer this type of teaching specifically? I actually think marketing is super important. And some of you might be like, what? Oh my God. And I think that's because we think of marketing as like being manipulative, when it's really about sending a message. So, oh, okay, you were following up, follow-up question on marketing. So I think you can, and I think we should market these things. And when I say market them, it's like, think about how the person you want to serve is thinking about their problems and what they're looking for, what they need in their language. And then can you provide a bridge, or can you provide that? Number one is the first question. And then can you provide an avenue that feels safe and accessible for them to access that? So if you're thinking about, should I just be available all the time? Maybe you have, 1 to 3 on Wednesdays is my drop-in, like office hours or something like that. But I think just sort of being there and waiting and seeing who shows up is like a little too loose of a frame. So we want to think about what's going to be the healthiest sort of attachment-informed frame where we can build a relationship and there's an opportunity for that. Okay, so I would say, think of marketing as communicating with people you want to help, and then build that bridge, but start with like what's going to be sustainable for you, because so many of us in these professions, we like give, I want to be there for everyone, there's so much trauma, and then we burn out. So if you start preemptively with your own needs and boundaries, I think that's going to be a better fit long term. How, as students, do we deal with bitchy teachers who chastise students? That is a wonderful question, Faye. I have been in classes where people have been chastised. I have, like I said earlier, heard teachers brag about chastising students. I honestly think it's, borderline, if not actually abusive, to shame students or to degrade them or call them names or insult them in front of other people in particular. So how to deal with it? One way could be the boundary of, this class does not feel like a safe or healthy environment for me, so I will not be attending it. Another thing you could do, and when something abusive is directed at us, it's hard because sometimes we want to stand up for it, but that feels really difficult. So I think it's a very personal choice if you go beyond building that boundary. But if you do want to say something, I, have done this before, approached a teacher and said, that really wasn't okay for me. That made me feel this way. And I want to understand why you're behaving that way. If someone is just, chastising or not changing their behavior, then to me, that's an unhealthy dynamic. And I think the end of it is just removing yourself. But you can absolutely open a conversation, give feedback. If this is a studio or a place that has an option on the website, a box with a feedback, comments, you can say something there. You could email or DM or whatever modes of communication we have these days to say something, just to let them know like how their behavior was making you feel. I think I've also heard of circumstances where a student in a class has approached a teacher and said, the way you treated that other person made me feel really unsafe, because if you do it to them, you could do it to me, and I don't think that's okay. And that might be a little easier. It depends on all of us, kind of what feels accessible and what doesn't for us. But when we can, I think it is important that we speak up. I also don't want to put the burden of speaking up on people who are essentially being abused or victimized. So hopefully that answers your question. And I'm sorry that that's happening, because that does happen. Another avenue would be from a larger perspective, just to try to understand the teacher and their training and their context. I mean, there are teachers that are just acting out their family dynamics with a class all the time, right? So yeah, okay, I'm just gonna scan and see if there's any other questions in the Q&A box. About the program, is it 8 weeks consecutive? It is 8 weeks consecutive, and we give everyone 12 weeks to complete the material. There is an extension process if you need more time than that. So right now we have a fall season, so it'll go for all of September through October into half of November, but then folks will have through mid-December to finish the material, to do the reflection questions, things like that. Oh, Kim, the difference between complex trauma and regular trauma. Well, we don't have enough time right now. Well, regular, I would say, like, between complex trauma and PTSD, the main thing I can say quickly is sometimes PTSD is just a single incident, say like a car accident or something that has like a really short time boundary. Whereas complex trauma tends to be something that happens relationally between people over time, repeatedly, sometimes over the course of development as well. So that's the short answer to your question. Yes, we will do, the next training will be January of 2022 to answer that question, Gaia. All right, I'll go back to the chat, see if there's any last questions before we wrap up. You're welcome. Thanks for sticking around. It's been great to be here with you guys, and I hope we can stay connected. However we stay connected these days, social media, email. I'd love to hear from you, what you loved, what questions you have that come up after this. So please feel free to email me at lisa@howwecanheal.com. All right, so sending all of you guys lots of love, and those of you that put your email in the Q&A or the chat, I'll look there too. I will send you a copy of How You Can Heal, and Faye, you'll get your copy as soon as we get your address. Take care, everybody. Have a beautiful day. Thanks for being here. Bye.